let me introduce myself. I'm Dr. Ross. I really feel, so when I first started functional medicine, I was kind of dabbling, so to speak, what really drew my passion. And I had a couple doctors that I studied under who did amazing things with women and helping them normalize and regulate their hormonal rhythm. And not only that, having the ability to grow and start a family for these women who were struggling and having difficulty, and men as well who were struggling and having difficulty for growing a family. So in my eyes, there was nothing more pleasing than being able to help another person grow their family. And the other aspect is women have it tough. Men, I'm being straightforward, have it easy. It's pretty simple. We release testosterone, and we have little bouts of rage. I can imagine people can comment maybe more than that. But women have a symphony of hormones going on. Such a flow and balance which can be really altered very easily. So let me just say sorry on behalf of that, I guess, or but that's kind of my approach. So what we'll be going over today will be, first, like anything else, it's always helpful to know the how and the why to understand really what's going on, or to understand, okay, I know the how, I know the why. Now it's that much easier to implement what's going on. So, and then we'll also talk about how important fat is. We'll quickly touch upon that. We'll talk about some other pieces, because it's not just strictly estrogen and progesterone. If we have our scope that narrow, we're going to miss the mark every time. So we need to talk about other factors that are influencing as well. Thyroid would be another key factor. We'll also talk about some key testing that we'll be able to provide you and give you more information. Otherwise, I have the analogy, I'd much rather get some hard quantitative values, and rather than just kind of throw something on the wall and hope it sticks, more or less. And then we're going to go over some take-homes. Every talk with me, it's important that, okay, I invested some time, I invested some brain power, but I need to have take-homes. And that's how I feel, and I want to be able to provide that for audience as well. So we'll first start, So we'll first start estrogen. What is estrogen? Is it this demonized, hormone that most women kind of have an association with? Well, first of all, we have to understand estrogen is a broad, terminology. There's more to it than just estrogen. So when we break up your estrogen, it breaks into three categories. Your E1, which is estrone, your E2, which is estradiol, your E3, which is estriol. E2 during cycling years is going to be your most active hormone. There's also thought that during your menstrual years, that's why there's a lot of association with breast cancer, that E2 is considered the most carcinogenic or harmful hormone as well. So that's why modulating and keeping track of your estrogen, mainly your E2, is pretty important. And then basically what happens is, after we're done cycling, in our menopause, we're still producing estrogens and progesterone, just not at the rate that you once were when you were cycling. And majority of the estrogen and progesterone will be released from the adipose tissue, the liver, the kidneys, and the adrenals. So that's important to know, that even when a female is done cycling, we still need to be looking at the progesterone and estrogen levels, and we still need to be able to balance that out.
What is adipose tissue?
Is fat tissue, visceral fat. Yep. So your fat is like a little hormone factory all on its own. So when we talk about losing fat, you need to have a conversation about detoxification when we're talking about fat reduction, because they are their own hormone factories, and they release they can hold xenoestrogens or xenotoxins, and they can release that, and that's why patients sometimes when they're losing fat, they notice they might feel a little bit crummier when that's happening. We'll head to the next slide. And then the wonderful, highly touted progesterone. So this is to be considered the molecule of life, so to speak. And we'll talk about how estrogen and progesterone kind of work with one another in just a moment. But really, like estrogen balancing progesterone is really good for improving hair and skin quality. It can do more than just interfere or interact with your ovulation, but it also can open up what's called the GABA chloride channel, which is in your brain. And that's what helps to get the body to relax and helps for sleep and helps you to get into a little bit more of a parasympathetic state. So progesterone isn't just something that interacts with the ovaries, it also interacts with the brain as well. And then we really want to make sure that this hormone is not dropping in the luteal phase. I'll explain that in more detail, but the gist of that is we want to make sure progesterone is always nice and smooth. We never want to see a stair-stepping effect of your progesterone. As that happens, probably a lot of you can comment or have experience. Yeah, I noticed, a week or so, or maybe even a couple days before I have my period, I get a lot of symptoms. Well, typically in the way the cycle is regulated, it's due to progesterone dramatically crashing or there being a fluctuation in the rhythm of progesterone, which I'm going to explain in just a moment. It's all going to make sense and basically tie together. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we go. This is basically the entire physiological process. If I see some heads nodding off, I'll kind of try to make loud noises or something and get you back on track. But this is the gist of what's going on through a typically 28-day cycle. So it's considered in normal rhythm of a menstrual cycle follows what's called the lunar cycle, which is the moon cycle. And so the lunar cycle typically runs 28 days. Just like with anything else, doesn't mean just because I'm not in 28 days that something is wrong with me. It's like a fingerprint. Everyone has a slight little bit different, slight variation. But that being said, a cycle should go anywhere between 26, the shortest you can really have a cycle is 24, and then should be no longer than 34 days. I'll explain why. So, as you can see, we have three phases. We have our follicular phase. So this is the phase that needs to have at least 10 to 12 days. This is the phase that we start to build up the endometrium. This is where we start preparing the uterus for possible implantation. And how this gets built up, so you can see the top here, there's a couple different colors. I won't get into the chemicals that are released to the brain, but basically the brain says we need to release something called FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. FSH then tells estrogen to build up during the follicular phase. Estrogen is what builds the endometrium. So then we build up the endometrium with the estrogen. We get to about day 14, typically in a 28-day cycle. Typically you can have 2 to 3 days of ovulation. So we have a giant spike in estrogen, giant spike in the LH, and that releases an egg. And that's called ovulation. So what happens here, once that egg is released, we make something called a corpus luteum, which in Latin that basically means white body. And this corpus luteum releases progesterone. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. We'll circle back to that. But what happens is, so we have ovulation. Ovulation stimulates to release luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone then triggers progesterone, the red here, to spike up really high. Progesterone, pro-gestation, pro-life. So endometrium, progesterone needs, in order to have pregnancy, needs to be maintained so that the egg can penetrate the endometrium. So really, really important. That's why in procreation, when we're trying to maintain a pregnancy, we really need to put a lot of attention on making sure there's a nice normal rhythm in your progesterone, because any drop in that curve could be possible miscarriage, possible the ability to expand your life and expand your family. So really important that we keep a close eye on that if that's your goal. If your goal is, I don't want to have drastic hot flashes, I'm done with having my headaches all the time, I'm done with having my cramps, that's another thing we need to keep an eye on, and making sure that progesterone doesn't drastically drop, around 24, 25 days, and then it goes right into bleeding. So again, I know I'm kind of spewing a lot here, but FSH, estrogen. Estrogen builds your endometrium, then we ovulate, then we release something called luteinizing hormone, which will then bring up our progesterone. Okay? That's basically the gist of it. And as you can see here, why I mentioned we need at least 26 days is because we do 24 days. You have at least 10 days of your follicular phase, at least 2 days of an ovulation, and at least 12 days of your luteal phase. So again, making sure that's a 24 cycle at minimum that we need to have, because we need to have enough time for you to make your endometrium, to make that lining. We need to have enough time to ovulate, and we need to have enough time for that progesterone to stay up. Okay, does that make sense? I know that's a lot there, but that's really the physiology that's really important. And there are 3 things that I focus on when we're dealing with maintaining normal rhythm. We need to make sure we have the correct timing. So timing looks like this. We have ovulation around day 14. We're maintaining the luteal phase for 12 days. So that's timing. We make sure we have enough. So production, we're producing enough estrogen, we're producing enough progesterone. And then also is the timing. I think I meant distribution. So distribution, production, and timing. Timing is making sure we're having ovulation around day 14. Those are the 3 factors when looking at just estrogen and progesterone. Again, that's distribution, production, and timing. Okay? But we have to ask ourselves, the big question is, why? Why are my hormones going awry? Why are my hormones not in the correct distribution? Why am I not producing enough hormones? Why is my ovulation shifted? Let's find the root cause here. Why are my hormones going awry? And we have to look outside the box. We can't just look at just progesterone, estrogen. So this is where it comes into talking about adrenal function, making sure we have good adrenal function, and we have to talk about thyroid function. Both of these produce hormones that influence our estrogen and progesterone. So real quick, I'm going to do one more physiological talk, and then I promise we'll get more exciting than this. So we'll just talk about the adrenals real quick and connect it to estrogen and progesterone. So next slide, please. Yep. Okay, so we're going to talk about all of this right now. No. So I'm a little bit of a nerd, so I like this. But next slide. Or if you want to take a picture, go ahead. Can you go back so she can grab a picture? That was just a little bit of a joke. That's okay. Next slide. So we'll make it a little bit simpler, a little bit easier to digest. Okay. So first and foremost, before I want to move forward with this, notice what's in the very top left corner. Cholesterol. We tend to demonize cholesterol. We tend to demonize fat. But in order to make hormones, we need cholesterol as your primary building block. So if there's one take home I can leave you with is let's try not to demonize cholesterol and fat. In order to have that raw material, in order to have that primary building block, we need cholesterol. Don't get me wrong, I don't want you going to Burger King or McDonald's and having, 6 Big Macs. That's not the cholesterol we want, but we need to make sure we have an adequate amount, not only for our brain, but for our hormones when we're talking about normal production. Okay, so the next aspect here, I want you to look at, try not to get too confused with all the words on here, but I want you to key on 3 words. 1 being your aldosterone, 2 being your cortisol, and number 3 is in the top right that says DHEA. These are 3 hormones that are produced by your adrenal glands. And as you can see, we can see, wait, this word looks familiar, progesterone. That's what I'm here for, right? These 2 words, estradiol, E2, and estrone, we know those are estrogens, right? That's what we're here for. Hey, it's kind of funny that we see that they're tied in together. Progesterone will come down and make aldosterone. Progesterone can be shuttled over and down to make cortisol. And if we look at DHEA, if we follow it down, it can make estradiol and estrone. So isn't that kind of interesting how they're tied in together, the adrenals and our sex hormones? So this is why it's so important. When we're constantly stressed, when we're constantly in overdrive, we're constantly requiring the adrenals to function and kind of take over the jobs of other organ systems, the body prioritizes to make sure let's function and deal with stress now rather than reproduction, rather than taking care of our hormones. So if the body has the option, if you say, I'm super stressed out, I'm just going constantly, but I also need to make hormones, our sex hormones, it's gonna steal from your sex hormones. It's gonna prefer, hey, I can't make progesterone right now. I need to survive. I need adrenal function. So it'll prioritize to make aldosterone, it'll prioritize to make cortisol, and it will stop at DHEA. It won't shuttle down the pathway into estrogen and estrone if we're in that constant fight or flight. So that's kind of the take home of this slide, is that fat is really important and that we need to make sure adrenal function is working effectively so we don't prioritize adrenal function over sex hormones. That's kind of the aspect. And then this is just a quick slide here talking about, some people miss it. They think it's, again, so much sex hormones, progesterone, estrogen. We have to look at thyroid. So this is basically to say, making sure we're running a correct thyroid markers, looking at your TSH, looking at your free and total T4 and T3, looking at your reverse T3, making sure we're not going down autoimmune like Hashimoto's. So a lot of, I don't want to make this a weight about weight, but a lot of this can be tied into weight loss or weight gain on the other end if this isn't taken care of. Same with the adrenals. If the adrenals aren't taken care of and we're not balancing them, it can start to affect how we manage our weight as well. So just kind of to show you, how tied in the adrenals are with the thyroid, and vice versa, the thyroid are with the adrenals. So we need to make sure we look at that picture when we're talking about sex hormones. Does that kind of make sense? Because that can be missed pretty easy, and you'd be amazed, correcting or looking at one body system, something that sits right here, and how it can influence our weight, can influence our adrenals, it can influence our sex hormones, it can influence our metabolism. Really important. Okay, so now big picture here. So what does that all mean when I just said? And I kind of hinted upon it earlier. So if we're constantly running from the tiger, if we're constantly in fight or flight, we're constantly worrying about, we got to pick up the kids, we got to make sure we're on work on time, I have a million tasks that I have to manage, I have 3 employees that I have to make sure are working and doing their job, I have the husband or the significant other, your partner is on your back for something. These constant stressors, whether they be chemical, physical, emotional stressors, which are driving that sympathetic state, driving that running from the tiger, what our estrogen and progesterone are doing, if we're constantly in this state, we're constantly, hey, what a great day. I went and spent the morning burning bridges in sympathetic state, and then I spent the rest of the day putting out fires. That's your estrogen and progesterone. So your estrogen and progesterone is going to prefer to put out fires, aka shift their hormones to the adrenals so the adrenals can handle stress. Like I talked about, if the body is in fight or flight and stress constantly, it's going to prefer survival rather than reproduction. Any day of the week, body's saying, I don't need to reproduce right now. What I need to do is survive. So it shifts again, like we talked about earlier, shifting progesterone and estrogen to the aldosterone, to the cortisol, to the DHEA, so the adrenals can work effectively. Does that kind of make sense now, the big picture? Okay, so how do we know what that looks like? How do we test for that? Again, we're not throwing, really important with me is that we're not kind of throwing something on the wall and hoping it sticks. We're actually evaluating what's going on. So we can start off really general by running your standard blood test. In that blood test, we want to look at something called pregnenolone. That is what I call the mother precursor. So all those, if you could just jump back to that one more. Mother hormone, just like cholesterol. So if we don't have cholesterol and we don't have pregnenolone, we're not going to be able to make these hormones efficiently. So you can head back now. So pregnenolone is crucial, and we can measure that, and we can actually give you the molecule of pregnenolone if it's low in the body. So we make sure we measure that. I typically want a female or male to have right around anywhere from 50 to 100 nanograms per deciliter of pregnenolone. Next marker we want to look at is progesterone. Obviously, we want to make sure that's in a healthy range. Another marker that we want to look at is cortisol. So these three markers are your adrenal markers that we want to look at. I want cortisol in this patient. Their cortisol is too low. Their pregnenolone is not bad. It's heading in the right direction. I would like a cortisol around 10 typically. Last marker we look at is your DHEA. I would like this marker typically around the 500s. If that marker is too high, we have to be worried about kind of acne buildup, possibly polycystic ovarian syndrome. So we keep a close eye on that. But this is just general markers that we can run. Some more markers here. We want to make sure we're also looking at your luteinizing hormone, your follicle stimulating hormone. Remember earlier, that was the one, the FSH is the one that was in the first start of the phase, and then your luteinizing hormone is the one that influenced the second half of the stage, the progesterone. So we want to make sure we look at these hormones. This also gives you an insight into how the brain, the hypothalamus, is talking to the pituitary, and how the pituitary is talking to the ovaries. So this gives some insight to the wiring. So you get, with the progesterone and estrogen, you get to look at ovary function. With the luteinizing hormone and FSH, you get to look at the wiring as well. So it gives you some more insight. Obviously, estradiol, that's the E2, that's the active hormone when we're cycling. We want to make sure we're evaluating that number as well.
Yeah. Yep. So if your cycle is super irregular, how can you know what the numbers should be then?
Yep. So if it's super irregular, you're typically going to see that through your total estrogen. So we'll run an estradiol, and we'll also run your total estrogens. And we'll be able to compare your estradiol to your total estrogens, and we'll be able to provide some clinical insight by evaluating those two. Yep. All right. And then there is some advanced testing. Now, say we have someone who has irregular cycles like that or is all over the place. So we can do something that's called a Dutch mapping. This is a 30-day test. You basically pee on a little bit of a piece of paper, you let it dry, you do it for 30 days, every other day, and we actually can assess the function of estrogen and progesterone throughout that 30-day cycle. So with someone in that example, you would probably see, your progesterone coming up and then dropping, then coming back up and dropping. You would just see an irregular pattern. It almost looked like an EKG. Beep, beep, beep. So this is your progesterone 30-day map. This is your estrogen, a 30-day map, and it gives us some good insight. This is probably one of the most powerful pieces of information we can get, because we can actually support areas like, for this example, probably around day 20 for her, we know that she's dropping slightly in her progesterone, so we can support that point in her cycle to make sure she doesn't have that dip. That small dip in progesterone could be a headache. It could be a cramp. It could be a mood swing. So we make sure we normalize that curve, and we just want to make it nice and smooth, and so it doesn't have that dip. Same with estrogen. The test on the other side is another Dutch test. This looks at your estrogen metabolites. So estrogen, when we break it down, it turns into a metabolite. So we want to make sure we're clearing that effectively. If we have a buildup in estrogen metabolites, that's where we can run into PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome. We can run into endometriosis. Certain estrogens that build up can be cancerous. So we want to see that we're clearing those estrogens. I won't get too much else into it. I can nerd out frequently with that, but that's another really good test as well that you could run. Okay, so we can have too much of a good thing. So we can have too much estrogen, we can have too much progesterone. I've already kind of talked about this. So when we're looking at your estrogen progesterone ratio throughout the month, you want a progesterone to estrogen ratio roughly 25-1. And so I'm sure you've heard of the term estrogen dominance. So there's two presentations of estrogen dominance. You can have estrogen very high with normal progesterone, or you can have normal estrogen with low progesterone. So you see how that kind of works? Because you can technically, in theory, have estrogen dominance if your progesterone's really low. So there's two ways you have to look at that. So making sure, and again, the testing that we do evaluates it as well. So like I talked about, if we have high estrogen, we can drive polycystic ovarian syndrome. Polycystic ovarian syndrome also is highly influenced by insulin resistance. So at the premise of this, it's controlling blood sugar. That's the most important thing. We can have endometriosis. Again, that's when we have estrogen dominance. We can get materials building up that are in the uterus, not clearly shedding the uterus 100%. We can have buildup that way. We can drive cancer, as we already talked about. If we're not clearing estrogens effectively, we can create harmful metabolites.
Are there certain cancers related to that, or any cancer?
So that's mainly like your ovarian cancer. It can also influence breast cancer. Those are the two most studied. It very well could, but to be honest, I just can't. Haven't done enough research to speak on other cancers. Obviously, we talked about if estrogen or progesterone dips, we can have headaches, migraines, mood swings, depressions. We can have breast nodules depending on your levels of estrogen and progesterone. And then, so quickly, I thought it'd be nice to talk about bioidentical versus non-bioidentical. So now we're getting a little bit of the treatment aspect. So really important that if we're thinking about using progesterone or estrogen, using a bioidentical source. A bioidentical source is something that comes from a plant-based hormone, typically soy or wild yam. Typically what we use here is a wild yam, or it's a gourd called Diascaria, and that's a bioidentical. But let's rephrase our thinking here, because most doctors will tell you, oh yeah, this is bioidentical, this is non-synthetic. Any hormone anything that's being turned to make a hormone is synthetic. It's being made in a lab, it's being altered. But the key here that the bioidentical they match your hormonal structure. So they can turn the molecule to look exactly like estrogen and exactly like progesterone, which is crucial, because if you use a non-bioidentical, it doesn't look exactly like your normal molecule of progesterone or your normal molecule of estrogen, but it will still bind to the receptor on the estrogen or progesterone receptor, because it looks just enough like it, but it's not identical like a bioidentical. So what happens is it can create harmful metabolites, because now when it breaks down, it has, a kink in it that isn't shaped the right way, or it has a different carbon on it that wasn't on your normal carbon, and it can create that harmful metabolite. It also can change the receptor. So then now when a normal molecule of progesterone binds to it, it's not the same shape, and it doesn't basically the key doesn't fit in the lock as easily. And the more that happens, the more the receptor gets changed and more the receptor gets used to the non-bioidentical. And then lastly, since it's not bioidentical, it's hard to regulate how much of that hormone it's going to produce. Since it's not exactly the same molecule, it may end up producing 2 times more estrogen than anticipated, 3 times more estrogen than anticipated, because we just don't know how it's going to react exactly. So those are things just to be aware of. So moral of the story, if you're going to do anything, bioidentical. Something that everyone kind of wants to talk about, oral contraceptive. Is this something I should do? If this is something I should stay away from? I heard it's bad for us, or this is something that I get a lot. So first, before we talk about this, let's talk about what birth control does. So birth control, how it works is basically we're tricking the body that it's in pregnancy. So what happens is you have a hormone that's released from the hypothalamus. That's called gonadotropin releasing hormone. Basically what happens is we have a couple different types of contraceptive. You have a progestin-based contraceptive, you have an estrogen and progestin-based contraceptive, and then you have also a 3-month progestin-based contraceptive, so you can still cycle. But what it does is it basically tricks the body that we don't need to release gonadotropin releasing hormone. We have enough hormone, we don't need to release anymore. So that shuts down, remember that follicular phase was first, so it shuts down that follicular phase. And as you can see, if that shuts down, everything else gets shut down. So we don't ovulate, we don't produce a corpus luteum that releases progesterone, everything kind of just stops functioning. Also, the oral contraceptive it thickens the cervical mucosa. So if a sperm were to get in, it is difficult, or it makes it difficult for the sperm to enter and penetrate through the cervical mucosa, basically killing it. So those are the 2 ways that oral contraceptives work. That being said, I don't want to demonize oral contraceptive. For a woman who has extremely painful menstrual cycles, they have extreme cramping that are unbearable, there may be a time and place for oral contraceptive if that's the case. Typically, if we're doing it just for prevention methods, let's have a talk, and maybe there's healthier ways to go about that. Again, that might be your own interpretation. But if it was my daughter, or if that was a conversation we had to have, we'd be talking about probably better safe sex methods rather than taking a chemical or something to shut down her cycle. Besides that, anyways, if we are on an oral contraceptive, we can take low dose of progesterone in that luteal phase, that last half, to help relieve some of those PMS symptoms. Because remember what I talked about. Yeah, I notice I get cramps, a couple days before my period. I notice I get, a lot of pain or a lot of mood swings before my period or headaches. Again, remember that phase right before we bleed. So we bleed, luteal phase, follicular phase, luteal phase. So if we take care of that end of the cycle, we don't notice as much side effects at the beginning of the cycle. So that's basically what that means. And then if we're coming off oral contraceptive, we need to make sure we're getting our estrogen and progesterone levels back to normal. We're preparing the woman to be able to have a child. So really important that we're going to end up having low estrogen on oral contraceptive. Our progesterone is going to be completely haywire, and that whole hormonal rhythm is going to be shut down. So we need to make sure we reestablish that normal rhythm. Again, focusing on the luteal phase. That's the last part. And then also making sure we're detoxing, clearing the synthetic hormones. Really important. Okay, so some quick take-homes. What can I do? So some of these first couple ones are going to be obvious, but I think it's always important to drive this home. Healthy diet, making sure we're eating adequate fat. Remember, fat is that primary building block to make all of our hormones. Healthy, adequate diet, what's that mean? Comes from the ground. It was put in the earth by God. We eat it. Gluten-free, dairy-free, typically some type of paleo diet is what I recommend for most. That is a great start. If you're starting there, that's a huge win. Healthy lifestyle choices or exercising, correct exercise prescription. Not too much, not too little. Well, that's generic. What does that mean? So at least 3 days, roughly 45 minutes of moderate intensity. You should at least be getting your heart rate up somewhat. That's typically the correct amount of exercise prescription. If we go over that, we tend to drive our adrenals into the ground, and we tend to, again, drive that sympathetic response, which we want to stop running from the tiger.
I've heard that for menopausal women, they shouldn't exercise as hard.
Absolutely. Again, yep, absolutely agree. So it's, again, going into not driving that sympathetic state. Yep, I would agree 100%. Yep. And then hydration well, half your body in fluid ounces. If you can't get the half your body in fluid ounces, shoot for that goal. I know it's a lot, but that's what I would recommend. Stress management, meditation, making sure we're driving that parasympathetic. We're not always in that go, go, go kind of state. Really important. Trying to moderate alcohol use, just being aware of that. Making sure we have a healthy digestive function, that we're, pooping well, having a good bowel movement a day, that it's well formed, that we're absorbing our nutrients and minerals effectively. That's really important and can be kind of missed. Addressing adrenal stress. So I have a couple other tips for the adrenal stress in the next slide, but real quick, what's that look like? Using licorice root, using pregnenolone, using some DHEA, using some of those markers to help normalize that adrenal function will be really helpful with that. Addressing the thyroid component, at least looking at the thyroid, looking at the TSH, looking at the free and total T4, T3, looking at those markers to see if thyroid is one of the pieces tying in here. We're also, like we talked about, if we're going to do estrogen and progesterone, making sure we're doing bioidentical forms, really important, okay? If we're on birth control pill, if we want to try to start a family, giving yourself a year from when you're getting off the birth control, really giving yourself a year to establish good hormonal rhythm function to start that family. I wish it was I can stop and I can, for some, they might be able to get lucky, they might, but it's not just I stop and I'm ready to go. We have to reestablish that normal rhythm. Okay, so now here comes some other things that you can try. So if you want to try natural progesterone, some good herbs, chaste tree, black cohosh, those are good things to try. Being careful, just let me preface here, just be careful with dosage. If you're not, if you're just kind of trying to wing it, I would just caution, just go slow on that if you're trying to do that. Some adrenal support, more commonly known as your adaptogens, rhodiola, ginseng, Asian ginseng, cordyceps. These are all really good for adrenal health. Estrogen support, dong quai, pomegranate. These are really good for estrogen. If we have low estrogen, which can be a case, helping support that. Other Chinese herbs that help to regulate menstrual flow, Rimiana, Piori, I always get this one, I always say this one really, I butcher it. Catanopsis root, these are all Chinese herbs that can help to regulate flow. If we have excess estrogen, using fiber, using calcium D-glucarate, CDG, using indole 3-carbinol, these are things that are going to help to remove exogenous or extra estrogens. And then also making sure we have good liver function. Because if we're going to remove those, we need to have good liver function. If something's going to bind and remove those, we need to make sure the liver's working correctly. So what's that mean? Choline, inositol, N-acetylcysteine, glutathione, alpha-lipoic acid, sulfur amino acids. These are all very helpful to help improve liver function. I won't get into coffee enemas, but that'll be in for another talk. Another thing, if we're dealing with polycystic ovarian syndrome, remember this is all about insulin sensitivity. This is all about glucose and insulin. So if we're dealing with this, making sure we're taking binders, such as your fiber, such as your calcium D-glucarate, such as your indole 3-carbinol, these could be considered binders. Making sure we're adding alpha-lipoic acid. Alpha-lipoic acid and berberine do a really good job in modulating and regulating your insulin and glucose. So that's a really helpful tip there. And then next, working on clearing toxins and metals. So evaluating if that's an issue. Do I need to clear metals? Am I holding on to, or am I recirculating? If I'm losing weight, am I recirculating the hormone factory from my adipose tissue and recirculating metals and recirculating toxins? So again, working on liver function, which we talked about with the choline, with the inositol, etc. So those are some really key tips there.